The first snow of winter came early that year, dusting the Wyoming plains like flowers spilled across a dark table. Clara Whitmore stood at her cabin window, watching the flakes settle on the 2 wooden crosses that marked the graves behind her house. One for Samuel, taken by Confederate bullets at Shiloh. The other for Thomas, who'd left for the gold fields of California and returned in a pine box. His death as mysterious as the fortune he'd never found. The folks in Powder Ridge called her the widow's curse. 2 husbands buried before her 30th year. Surely, they whispered, no coincidence could be that cruel. The women crossed themselves when she passed on the street. The men tipped their hats but kept their distance, as if death itself clung to her skirts like prairie dust. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and turned from the window. The cabin felt smaller each day, its log walls pressing in like the ribs of some dying beast. She'd built it with Thomas, back when hope still lived in her chest. Now it housed only echoes and the persistent scratch of her needle through fabric, the only trade that kept food on her table and wood in her stove. The pile of mending sat accusingly in the corner. Mrs. Henderson's petticoat, the Reverend's winter coat, work that should have been delivered yesterday. But the general store had refused her credit again. Best you find somewhere else to do your shopping, Mrs. Whitmore, old Patterson had said, not meeting her eyes. Folk are getting nervous, what with you being, well, what you are. A widow, a curse, a woman alone in a world that had no place for such creatures. Clara struck a match and lit the oil lamp, its weak flame barely pushing back the gathering dark. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers. She should check on the chickens, make sure the coop was secured against the storm. But exhaustion weighted her limbs, the kind that sleep couldn't cure. She'd just sat down with her sewing when she heard it, the distinctive sound of a horse in distress. Not the usual prairie sounds of coyotes or wind, but the labored breathing of an animal pushed too hard, too far. Clara froze, needle suspended mid-stitch. Visitors after dark meant trouble. The last time someone had come calling at this hour, it was Sheriff Watson to tell her about Thomas. The horse whinnied, closer now. Through the thin walls, she heard the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Then a heavy thud like a sack of grain hitting the earth. Clara set aside her sewing and reached for the shotgun mounted above the door. Samuel had taught her to shoot before he marched off to war. A woman alone needs to be twice as careful, he'd said. If only he'd known how alone she would become. She eased open the door, shotgun raised. The wind slapped her face with icy fingers, driving snow into her eyes. By the faint light spilling from her doorway, she could make out a shape in the yard, a horse, head hanging low, steam rising from its flanks, and beside it, a darker shape sprawled motionless in the snow. A man, face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something he'd never grasp. Clara's first instinct was to bar the door and pretend she'd seen nothing. Let the cold claim him by morning. One less stranger in the world wouldn't matter to anyone, and it would spare her the questions, the suspicions. But as she watched, the man's fingers twitched, clawing weakly at the ground. Still alive, then barely. She could leave him, should leave him. What was one more dead man to a woman who'd already buried 2? But the horse, a beautiful bay despite its exhaustion, looked at her with dark, pleading eyes. Blood seeped from a gash along its flank, black in the moonlight. The animal took a stumbling step forward, as if asking for help its rider couldn't voice. "Damn you," Clara whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant the horse, the man, or the soft heart that had survived despite everything. She propped the shotgun against the doorframe and ventured into the storm. The man was heavier than he looked, solid muscle beneath his wet coat. Clara hooked her hands under his arms and dragged him inch by inch toward the cabin, her boots slipping on the fresh snow. He groaned once, a sound that might have been pain or protest, but didn't wake. By the time she got him inside, her dress was soaked with snow and what she suspected was blood. In the lamplight, she could see him properly. Tall, even crumpled on her floor, dark hair matted with snow and dirt. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against weather-beaten skin. His coat was good quality but worn, the kind a man wore when he'd been riding hard for days, or running from something. Blood had soaked through his shirt along his ribs. Clara knelt beside him, her hands unexpectedly steady as she unbuttoned his coat. The wound wasn't deep, a graze rather than a puncture, but it bled freely. A bullet wound, if she had to guess. She'd seen enough of them, tending to Samuel when he'd come home on leave with his arm full of shrapnel. The smart thing would be to tend his wound and send him on his way. Come morning, the last thing she needed was a bleeding stranger bringing more trouble to her door. But the storm was worsening, wind howling like a living thing. Even if he could ride, that horse wouldn't make it a mile in this weather. Clara fetched water and clean cloth, her movements automatic. How many times had she done this, played nurse to wounded men who would leave her one way or another? She cleaned the wound, noting the other scars that marked his body. This was a man acquainted with violence, who wore his history on his skin like a map of hard choices. She'd just finished binding the wound when his eyes opened. They were gray as winter sky, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her reach reflexively for the shotgun she'd left by the door. "Don't," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "I mean no harm." "Bleeding men rarely do," Clara replied, keeping her distance. "Until they're well again." His lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Fair enough." He tried to sit up, grimaced, and thought better of it. The horse? In the barn, wounded but alive. She'd led the animal in and done what she could for the gash, though her experience with horses was limited. "You running from something or toward it? Does it matter?" "It does if it's following you to my door." He studied her for a long moment, taking in the widow's black she still wore, the shotgun within easy reach, the hard set of her jaw. "What's your name?" "Clara Whitmore. And you'll be leaving come morning, Mr. Just Elias." No last name offered. "And I'll leave when I can ride without bleeding all over your clean floor." She should have insisted, should have thrown him out into the storm despite his wound, but something in his eyes, a weariness that matched her own, made her pause. "There's stew on the stove. You can sleep by the fire tonight. Come morning, we'll see about getting you on your way." Elias nodded, his eyes already closing again. "Obliged, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara stood and wiped her bloody hands on her apron. One more wounded man in her house, one more dangerous choice. But as she ladled stew into a bowl and stoked the fire higher against the cold, she realized the cabin felt less empty than it had in months, even if that fullness came in the shape of a scarred stranger who'd probably bring her nothing but grief. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them in together, the widow and the wounded man, with only the wind to witness what would come next. 3 days passed before the storm broke, 3 days of wary coexistence in the small cabin. Elias proved to be a man of few words, offering only his first name and nothing about where he'd come from or why he carried a bullet wound in his side. Clara didn't press. In her experience, men's secrets were like splinters. Dig too deep trying to extract them, and you'd only drive them deeper. He recuperated quickly, moving from the floor by the fire to sitting at her small table, watching her work with those unsettling gray eyes. On the second day, when she came in from feeding the chickens, she found him standing by the window, one hand pressed to his wounded side. "You should be resting," she said, setting down the egg basket. "Been resting my whole life. Seems like..." He turned from the window. "That roof needs fixing before the next storm. You got tools. I manage fine on my own. Didn't say you couldn't, just offering." Clara studied him, this stranger who spoke like he had a right to concern himself with her roof. "There's a toolbox in the barn, but you're in no shape. I've worked with worse wounds than this." She believed him. Everything about Elias spoke of a hard life. The way he slept light, hand twitching toward where a gun would rest. The way he ate, quick and efficient, like a man who'd learned meals could be interrupted. The scars that mapped his body like battle lines. By afternoon, despite her protests, he was on her roof, patching the holes that let in wind and snow. Clara found herself stealing glances through the window, watching him work. His movements were careful but competent, those of a man who'd learned to fix what was broken because there was no one else to do it. That evening, they ate in their usual silence, but it felt different somehow. Less wary, more companionable. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the wind had finally stilled. Clara found herself almost regretting the break in weather. Come morning, he'd have no reason to stay. "You're not from around here," she said finally, surprising herself by breaking the silence. "No. Running from the law." He set down his spoon, considering, "Would it matter if I was? I suppose that depends on what you did. And if I said I killed a man?" Clara met his eyes steadily. "I'd ask if he needed killing." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "3 men, actually. They killed my partner. Tried to take what we'd earned fair. I returned the favor. Self-defense. Then, the law doesn't always see it that way when you're the one left standing." She understood that. The law had its own kind of blindness, seeing only what it wanted to see. "You steal that horse?" "Bought and paid for, though I've been known to relocate a few in my time." He smiled grimly. "Folks tend to remember a horse thief. Makes it easier to overlook other sins." Clara rose to clear the dishes, uncomfortable with how easily she accepted his confession. A horse thief, a killer, and here she sat sharing supper with him like he was any ordinary man. But then, what was ordinary about any of them out here on the frontier? They were all running from something. "Why didn't you turn me in?" he asked suddenly. "Could have sent word to town when the storm broke. Collected whatever bounties on my head. You think they'd give a reward to the widow's curse?" The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "More likely they'd say I killed you myself. Add another ghost to my collection." "That what they call you? The widow's curse?" Clara turned away, busying herself at the wash basin. 2 husbands dead before I turned 30. In a place like this, that's enough to mark a woman. How did they die? No one had asked her that so directly. Usually, they whispered behind hands, spun their own theories. Samuel went to war, came home twice on leave, each time more ghost than man. The last time, he was so full of shrapnel they said it was a miracle he'd lived as long as he had. He died in that bed there, blood in his lungs, calling for his mother. She scrubbed a plate harder than necessary. Thomas was different, gentler. Thought he could find fortune in California gold. Come back and give me the life Samuel had promised. He made it to the fields, sent letters for a while. Then Sheriff Watson showed up one night, said Thomas was dead, shot through the heart on the trail back. They never found who did it or why. Never found the gold he claimed to have earned, either. So you buried them both. What else does a woman do? She set the clean plate aside with excessive care. Now I mend clothes for people who cross the street to avoid me. They take my work but won't let me buy supplies, like grief might be catching. People fear what they don't understand. And what do you understand about it? Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. I understand what it means to bury someone you thought would be there come morning, to wake up reaching for something that ain't there anymore. Clara turned to look at him. In the firelight, the scar on his face seemed deeper, a canyon carved by whatever had marked him. Who was she? Wife, Mary. The name seemed to cost him something. Fever took her and our boy while I was away on a drive. Came home to 2 graves and an empty house. That was 5 years back, maybe 6. Days run together after a while. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Clara dried her hands slowly, weighing her words. Does it get easier? No, just gets different. You learn to live around the hole instead of falling into it. She understood that too. The way grief became landscape, something you navigated daily until you forgot what the terrain looked like before loss reshaped it. Later, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. Clara with her sewing, Elias staring into the flames. The silence felt different now, weighted with shared understanding. When she pricked her finger and cursed softly, he handed her a handkerchief without being asked. "You should leave tomorrow," she said eventually. "Weather's clear. Your horse is healing well." "I should." But neither moved, and the fire burned lower, and the space between them seemed to shrink without either crossing it. When Clara finally rose to retire to her small room behind the curtain, Elias caught her wrist. His touch was gentle, calloused fingers barely pressing. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not turning away." Clara looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the scars that marked them both. "We're all just trying to survive the winter." She pulled away gently and disappeared behind the curtain, but she could feel his eyes following her. That night, she lay awake listening to his breathing beyond the thin fabric barrier, steady and deep, for the first time in months. The cabin didn't feel like a tomb. Come morning, she expected to find him gone. It would be better that way, cleaner, safer. Instead, she found him splitting wood in the dawn light, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. The stack was already twice what she'd managed to cut all fall. "Thought you were leaving," she said from the doorway. He buried the axe in the chopping block and turned to her. "Your barn door's hanging loose. Few more things need fixing before winter sets in proper." "I didn't ask for your help. Didn't offer it for you." He grabbed another log. "Man can't ride on leaving a debt unpaid." Clara wanted to argue, to send him away before the town noticed, before she grew accustomed to the sound of someone else in her space. Instead, she went inside and made coffee for two, telling herself it meant nothing, just hospitality for a man who'd be gone soon enough. But as the days passed and Elias found more things that needed fixing, she began to wonder which of them was really being saved. The days stretched into a week, then two. Elias made no mention of leaving, and Clara found herself no longer suggesting it. They fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing, him tending to the heavy work she'd struggled with alone, her keeping house and mending his worn clothes without being asked. They moved around each other like dancers who'd learned the steps through repetition rather than instruction. Winter pressed closer, bringing the kind of cold that made bones ache. Elias reinforced the chicken coop, patched every gap in the barn walls, and laid in enough firewood to last until spring. He set snares in the woods beyond the property, bringing back rabbits and the occasional deer. The meat filled her smokehouse, insurance against the lean months ahead. One evening, Clara watched him clean his rifle at the table, his movements methodical and practiced. "You planning to stay through winter?" The question escaped before she could stop it. He looked up, hands stilling on the gun. Would that be unwelcome? She turned back to her stew pot, stirring with more attention than it needed. "People will talk. People already talk." It was true. She'd gone to town for supplies the previous week, enduring the stares and whispers. Mrs. Henderson had pulled her aside at the general store, voice dripping with false concern. "Dear, we've heard you've taken in a boarder, a man. Surely you understand how inappropriate that appears." Clara had lifted her chin, meeting the woman's eyes. "As inappropriate as refusing credit to a paying customer? Mr. Patterson seems to have overcome his delicate sensibilities now that I have helped bringing in game to trade." The conversation had ended there, but Clara knew it was only the beginning. A widow living alone was one thing. A widow with a mysterious man under her roof was quite another. Now, standing in her kitchen with Elias watching her, she weighed the cost of his presence against the warmth of having someone to share the silence with. "You can stay through winter," she said finally. "But come spring, I'll be gone," he finished. "If that's what you want." She nodded, not trusting herself to examine too closely what she wanted. The next morning brought fresh snow and a new intimacy to their arrangement. Elias had taken to sleeping in the barn, partly for propriety, partly because old habits made him uncomfortable, sleeping inside walls he couldn't easily escape. But the temperature had plummeted overnight, and Clara found him at dawn, breath visible in the frigid barn air. This is foolish, she said. You'll freeze out here. Been colder. That's not the point. She hugged her shawl tighter. There's room by the fire. We can hang a blanket for privacy if you're concerned about appearances. He studied her, reading something in her face she wasn't sure she meant to show. All right. They spent the day rearranging the small space, stringing a rope across one corner and hanging an old quilt to create a makeshift room. It was barely more than a closet, but it afforded the illusion of separation. That night, Clara lay in her bed listening to him settle in beyond the curtain, every rustle and breath audible in the darkness. She must have dozed, because she woke to the sound of chopping. Not wood. The rhythm was wrong. She peered out the window to see Elias breaking ice on the water trough, his movements sharp and efficient in the pre-dawn darkness. Steam rose from the bucket he carried, and she realized he'd heated water for the animals. Something shifted in her chest, a feeling she'd thought buried with her husband's. She pressed her hand to her breastbone as if she could push it back down. When he came in, stamping snow from his boots, she had coffee waiting. They drank in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the snow-covered plains pink and gold. These quiet mornings had become her favorite part of the day. No need for words, just the warmth of another presence in the space she'd guarded so carefully. I need to check the trap line, he said eventually. Storm might have damaged them. I'll come with you. He raised an eyebrow. It's rough country. I've lived here 4 years. I know rough country. They set out after breakfast, Clara wearing Thomas's old coat over her dress. The snow came to her knees in places, but she matched Elias stride for stride, determined to prove she wasn't some delicate flower needing protection. The trap line ran along a frozen creek, following game trails through stands of pine and aspen. They worked in tandem, him checking and resetting traps, her collecting the rabbits they'd caught. The cold made her cheeks burn, but the exertion felt good after weeks spent mostly indoors. They were heading back, game bag pleasantly heavy, when it happened. Clara had fallen slightly behind, admiring how the ice had transformed a small waterfall into a cascade of frozen crystal. She didn't notice the drift covering the creek bank until her foot broke through, plunging her thigh deep into hidden water. The shock of cold stole her breath. She flailed, trying to find purchase, but the current pulled at her skirts, dragging her deeper. Then Elias was there, dropping the game bag and lunging for her. His hands caught her under the arms, hauling her out with a strength that surprised her. They tumbled backward into the snow, Clara landing on top of him in a tangle of wet skirts and limbs. For a moment, they lay frozen, his arms still around her, her hands braced on his chest. She could feel his heart racing under her palms, matching the wild beat of her own. You all right? His voice was rough, breath warm against her ear. Yes, She became suddenly aware of their position, of every place their bodies touched. Heat flooded her face. She scrambled to get up, but her waterlogged skirts tangled, sending her sprawling again. Elias steadied her, his hands gentle but firm. Easy. You're soaked through. We need to get you warm. He was right. Already her teeth were chattering, her wet clothes turning icy in the wind. Elias shed his coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her as easily as he might a child. I can walk, she protested. Not in those skirts, you can't, unless you want to lose toes to frostbite. She wanted to argue, but couldn't deny the logic. Instead, she let him carry her, trying to ignore how natural it felt to rest her head against his shoulder. He moved quickly through the snow, his breathing steady despite the burden. By the time they reached the cabin, Clara's shivering had become violent. Elias set her on her feet by the fire and immediately began building it higher. You need to get out of those wet things. She nodded, fumbling with numb fingers at her buttons. The fabric seemed to have frozen to itself, refusing to cooperate. A frustrated sound escaped her. Here. Elias moved behind her, his fingers working at the stubborn fastenings. She held herself still, acutely aware of each brush of his hands through the fabric. When the dress finally loosened, she clutched it to her chest. I can manage now. He stepped back immediately. I'll heat water for a bath. Clara escaped behind her curtain, stripping off the wet garments with clumsy haste. She could hear him moving about, stoking the stove, filling the tin tub they used for washing. By the time she emerged wrapped in a quilt, steam was rising invitingly from the water. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. "I'll be in the barn. Elias." Something in her voice stopped him at the door. "Stay, please. Just turn your back." He hesitated, then moved to face the wall. Clara dropped the quilt and stepped into the water, sighing as warmth seeped back into her bones. She washed quickly, aware of his presence, of the trust implicit in this moment. "I'm decent," she said once she'd dried and dressed. He turned, and something flickered in his eyes. Concern, relief, and something else she didn't dare name. "You scared me," he admitted. "When you went under, I scared myself." She moved closer to the fire, wringing water from her hair. "Though I suspect you've faced worse fears than a woman falling in a creek." Different kind of fear. The words were so quiet she almost missed them. They stood there, the fire crackling between them, the air charged with unspoken things. Clara felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her state of undress moments before. When Elias reached out to tuck a wet strand of hair behind her ear, she didn't pull away. "Clara," he began, then stopped, his hand dropping. "I know," she whispered, because she did know. Felt it in every careful distance he maintained, every glance that lingered too long, the growing warmth between them that had nothing to do with shared fires. That night, the blanket dividing their spaces seemed thinner than ever. Clara lay awake, listening to him breathe, remembering the solid warmth of his arms around her. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of spring and the leaving it would bring, waking with an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her near drowning. Outside, snow began to fall again, sealing them in together for another day, another night, another step toward something neither was ready to name. The whispers had become shouts by the time Deputy Sheriff Marcus Holbrook rode up to Clara's cabin on a gray February morning. Clara saw him coming through the window, his horse picking its way through the snow-covered yard, and her stomach tightened with familiar dread. Law meant questions. Questions meant trouble. "Get out of sight," she told Elias quietly. He was already moving, gathering his gun and coat. "I won't hide like a criminal in your home. You are a criminal, remember?" But there was no heat in her words. "Please, just until I know what he wants." Elias's jaw tightened, but he slipped out the back door toward the barn. Clara smoothed her hair, adjusted her dress, and opened the door before Holbrook could knock. "Deputy?" She kept her voice neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "Mrs. Whitmore." He touched his hat brim, though his eyes were already scanning past her into the cabin. "Mind if I come in? Cold enough to freeze the devil himself out here." She stepped aside reluctantly. Holbrook entered, making a show of warming his hands by the fire while taking in every detail. The 2 chairs at the table, the man's coat on the peg by the door, the rifle that wasn't hers propped in the corner. "Coffee?" she offered, because refusing hospitality would only make things worse. "Obliged." He settled at her table like he had every right to be there. "Folks in town been talking." Mrs. Whitmore. "Folks in town always talk." True enough. But this time they're talking about strange men and stolen horses, about a widow woman harboring fugitives. His pale eyes fixed on her. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Clara poured coffee with steady hands. "I know I've hired help for the winter. Man named Elias. He's been fixing up the place, laying in game. Nothing strange about a woman needing help with heavy work." "This Elias got a last name?" "I didn't ask. He works hard and doesn't drink. That's all that matters to me." Holbrook sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim. "Patterson down at the store says this man of yours paid for supplies with California gold coins. Curious thing, that not many of those in circulation around here." Clara's mind raced. but she kept her expression calm. "I wouldn't know. I don't handle his money." "No, but you handle everything else, from what I hear." The insinuation in his tone made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'll speak plain. You've had poor luck with husbands. 2 dead, both mysterious circumstances. Samuel died from war wounds." Clara interrupted, anger flaring. "Nothing mysterious about that. And Thomas? Shot by bandits. Your own sheriff told me." "So we assumed. But then, we never found those bandits. Did we? Never found the gold he supposedly earned either." Holbrook leaned forward. "Now you've got another man under your roof, one who pays in California gold. Some might call that an interesting coincidence." Clara set down her cup carefully, afraid she might throw it otherwise. "What exactly are you implying, deputy?" "Just doing my job, looking out for the welfare of our citizens." He stood, adjusting his gun belt. "This Elias, he around? I'd like a word. He's checking traps. Won't be back until evening." "Convenient." Holbrook moved to the door, then paused. Word of advice. Mrs. Whitmore, you're already walking a narrow path in this town. Associating with questionable men, well, that path might disappear altogether. You could lose this land, lose everything. Is that a threat? It's a friendly warning, from someone who'd hate to see a woman alone face the consequences of poor judgment. He tipped his hat again. "I'll be back to speak with your hired man. Make sure he's available." Clara watched him ride away, her hands trembling now that he couldn't see. When Elias emerged from the barn, his face was dark with barely controlled anger. "I heard," he said before she could speak. "I should go. Tonight. Before what? Before they decide I murdered Thomas for gold I never saw? Before they run me out anyway?" Clara's voice cracked. "They've already made up their minds about me. Elias, your leaving won't change that. It might make it worse if I stay, or it might give me one person who doesn't look at me like I'm cursed." The words burst out before she could stop them. "I'm so tired of being alone, of being feared, of being—" She broke off, pressing her hands to her face. Elias crossed to her in 2 strides, pulling her hands away gently. "Clara, look at me." She did, finding her own pain reflected in his gray eyes. "I've brought you nothing but trouble," he said softly. "That deputy's right about one thing. I'm a questionable man. I've done things that would make decent folk turn away. I'm not decent folk. I'm the widow's curse. Remember?" She laughed bitterly. "Maybe we suit each other." His hands tightened on hers. "Don't say that. You're worth 10 of anyone in that town." "Then stay." The plea escaped in a whisper. "Just through the winter? Please." For a moment, they stood frozen, hands clasped, the space between them electric with possibility. Then Elias pulled her against him, and Clara went willingly, burying her face in his shirt. He smelled of wood smoke and pine, of safety despite all evidence to the contrary. "This is dangerous," he murmured into her hair. "Everything's dangerous." She pulled back to look at him. "I'd rather face it with you than alone." What happened next seemed inevitable as spring following winter. Elias cupped her face in his calloused hands, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. Clara's breath caught. Then his mouth was on hers, gentle at first, as if asking permission. She gave it, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, weeks of careful distance dissolving in an instant. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara felt transformed, marked, changed in ways that had nothing to do with curses and everything to do with the fierce light in Elias's eyes. "Clara," he started, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't apologize or analyze or pull away. Just let me have this moment." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You can have all my moments. That's what scares me." That night, they sat closer by the fire, the careful space between them abandoned. When Clara shivered, Elias pulled her against his side, and she let herself lean into his warmth. The blanket dividing their sleeping spaces seemed absurd now, a flimsy barrier against what had already been breached. "Tell me about before." she said quietly. "Before you became a horse thief. Before everything went wrong." Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the fire, he began to speak. About a farm in Missouri. A young man who thought love could overcome anything. A wife whose laughter could light up a room, and a son who had his mother's eyes. "I wasn't always hard," he said. "Mary used to tease that I was too soft for farming, too quick to help neighbors who wouldn't return the favor. She made me better than I was." His voice roughened. "When the fever took them, it took that part of me too. What was left wasn't worth much." Clara laced her fingers through his. "It's worth something to me." He turned to look at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her heart stutter. "You make me remember who I used to be. Make me want to be that man again. I don't need you to be anyone but who you are. Even if who I am brings the law to your door. Even if—" She silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her loneliness and longing into the contact. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark with desire and something deeper. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered. "Not forever. Not making any promises. Just tonight." Elias stood, pulling her up with him. For a moment, they hovered on the edge of decision. Then he led her to her small bed behind the curtain, and Clara followed, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. They came together like survivors of a shipwreck, desperate and grateful in equal measure. Clothes fell away along with the last pretense of distance. In the darkness, scarred hands found scarred hearts, and two broken people discovered that sometimes the sharp edges of one person's pain could fit perfectly against another's. Afterward, they lay entwined, Clara's head on Elias's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. Outside, wind rattled the windows, but inside their small circle of warmth, the world felt still. "What happens now?" she asked. His arm tightened around her. "I don't know, but whatever comes, we'll face it." Clara closed her eyes, letting herself believe it could be true, that curses could be broken, that third chances existed, that a widow and a horse thief could carve out a space for happiness in a world that wanted them separate and shamed. But even as sleep took her, she knew Deputy Holbrook would return, the town would judge, and spring would come, bringing its own reckonings. For tonight, though, she was just a woman in the arms of a man who saw her truly, and that, Clara thought, was its own kind of miracle. The morning came too soon, bringing with it a cold that seeped through the walls and into Clara's bones. She woke to an empty bed, the sheets beside her already cool. For a moment, panic seized her. He'd gone, fled in the night like she always knew he would. Then she heard the scrape of the stove door and smelled coffee brewing. She found Elias fully dressed, staring out the window at the brightening sky. Something in his posture made her stomach drop. "You're leaving?" It wasn't a question. He turned, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "It's better this way. Cleaner. Before that deputy comes back. Before what? Before we pretend last night meant something?" The words came out sharper than intended. "It meant everything." He crossed to her, catching her shoulders. "That's why I have to go. You heard Holbrook. They're already connecting dots, building a case against you. If you stay, I have someone who believes I'm not cursed, someone who—" She stopped, unable to voice what lived in her heart. Too new, too fragile, too impossible. Clara, just her name, waited with all the things they couldn't say. She pulled away, wrapping her shawl tighter. "There's bread from yesterday. Take what food you need. I'll send money when I can. For the supplies, the work. I don't want your money." She moved to the stove, her movements sharp and brittle. "Just go, if you're going." But he didn't go. He stood there, torn between the door and the woman who wouldn't look at him. The silence stretched until it snapped. "I love you," he said roughly. "I know I've no right to it, no business feeling it, but I do. And that's why—" Clara whirled, the coffee pot clattering forgotten. Don't you dare tell me you love me and leave in the same breath." That's worse than saying nothing at all. You think I want this? You think I want to ride away from the first good thing I've found in 5 years? His control cracked, voice rising. But I won't be the reason they take your land. I won't be another ghost for you to carry. You already are. The words tore from her throat. Ghost or man? You're already under my skin. Leaving won't change that. They stood facing each other, both breathing hard. The small kitchen suddenly too small for all their pain. Then Elias moved, pulling her against him with desperate strength. They clung to each other, Clara's tears soaking his shirt, his face buried in her hair. Stay, she whispered. We'll face whatever comes. Just stay. For a moment, she felt him waver. Then he pulled back, framing her face with his hands. Remember me kindly, he said, and kissed her, soft, sorrowful, final. Before she could respond, he was gone. The door closed with terrible quietness. Clara stood frozen, listening to his footsteps, the barn door, the whinny of his horse. When hoofbeats faded into distance, she sank to the floor and let grief take her. The first days were the worst. Clara moved through her chores mechanically, feeding chickens, tending the fire, forcing herself to eat. The cabin felt larger without him, full of echoes. His absence lived in every repaired board, every stack of split wood, every small comfort he'd added to her harsh existence. She burned the quilt that had divided their sleeping spaces, washed the sheets until her hands were raw, trying to scour away his scent. But at night, alone in the bed they'd shared so briefly, she could still feel the ghost of his warmth. 3 days after he left, she found the note, tucked under the coffee tin where she couldn't miss it forever, written in his careful hand. I should not have stayed, but my heart knows nothing of what is right. Take care of yourself. Clara, you deserve more than a worn-out thief could give. E. She read it until the words blurred, then fed it to the fire. Paper burned easier than memories. A week passed. The weather warmed slightly, though snow still blanketed the ground. Clara forced herself to go to town for supplies, enduring the fresh wave of whispers. Mrs. Henderson cornered her outside the church. We heard your hired man left rather suddenly. How fortunate, though one does wonder what payment he extracted for all that help. Her smile was sharp as glass. You really must be more careful. Dear, your reputation can hardly sustain more damage. Clara met her gaze steadily. My reputation seems to fascinate everyone but me, Mrs. Henderson. Perhaps you should find a more interesting subject for your concern. She left before the woman could respond, but the encounter soured her stomach. In the general store, Patterson served her with visible reluctance, and she noticed the prices had gone up, just for her, she suspected, walking home with her meager supplies. Clara made a decision. Come spring, she'd sell the land and leave, find somewhere new where the ghosts, living and dead, couldn't follow. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like another loss. That night, she sat by the fire trying to mend a torn dress, but her hands wouldn't steady. The knock at the door made her jump, needle pricking her finger. Her heart leaped foolishly, Elias, before common sense reasserted itself. The knock came again, harder. Mrs. Whitmore, open up. Not Elias. Clara recognized the voice. Jake Morrison, one of the ranch hands from the Rocking Bee. What would bring him here after dark? She opened the door cautiously. Shotgun within reach. Morrison stood on her step, hat in hand, clearly uncomfortable. Behind him, she could see 2 more riders waiting in the yard. Jake, what's this about? Sorry to bother you, ma'am, but there's been trouble. That man who was staying here, Elias, he's still around? Her heart stuttered, but she kept her voice level. He left over a week ago. Why? Horse theft, over at the Bentley spread. 3 prime stallions. Gone in the night. Mister, Bentley's offering good money to anyone who helps catch the thief. Morrison shifted nervously. Thing is, one of the hands saw a man matching your hired help's description near the ranch 2 days back. Elias left heading south. I don't know anything about stolen horses. Morrison studied her face in the lamplight. You sure about that, ma'am? Because if you're protecting him, I'm protecting no one. The man worked for me, then left. That's all I know. Mind if we check your barn, just to be thorough? Clara stepped aside. Help yourself. You'll find nothing but my old plow horse and some chickens. The men searched with theatrical thoroughness, even checking the hayloft. Clara waited, arms crossed, biting back bitter words. When they found nothing, because there was nothing to find, Morrison at least had the grace to look embarrassed. Sorry for the trouble, ma'am. Had to check, you understand. I understand perfectly. She didn't bother hiding her contempt. Good night, Jake. After they left, Clara barred the door and slumped against it. Horse theft at the Bentley Ranch. Was it Elias? Had he reverted to old habits? Or was this simply bad timing? Either way, suspicion would follow her now. The widow's curse. Harboring criminals. The story would grow in the telling. She went to bed but couldn't sleep. Every sound made her tense, waiting for more knocks, more accusations. When dawn finally came, she was exhausted and heartsick. The life she'd built here, small and hard as it was crumbling. And the man who might have helped her hold it together was gone, leaving only questions and consequences in his wake. Clara rose and dressed mechanically. There were still chores to do, still a life to maintain until she could arrange to leave. But as she stepped outside into the cold morning, she felt something inside her shut down. The last ember of warmth Elias had kindled flickered and died. She'd been a widow before he came. She'd be a widow after. Only now she mourned not just the men who'd died, but the one who'd chosen to leave. Somehow, that cut deeper than all the rest. The chickens clustered around her feet as she scattered feed, their simple needs a comfort. At least here, in this small duty, she could provide what was wanted. Could be enough, but as she worked, Clara couldn't shake the image of Elias's face that last morning, the way he'd said he loved her, the way he'd left anyway. "Remember me kindly?" he'd asked, standing in her empty yard, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been. Clara wasn't sure kindness was what she felt, but she would remember. That much. She couldn't help. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and turning the roads to mud. Clara had spent the winter months making arrangements, finding a buyer for the land, selling what possessions she could, trying to imagine a life somewhere beyond Powder Ridge. The house felt like a shell now, emptied of meaning. She was packing her few books when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. Through the window, she saw Deputy Holbrook leading a group of 5 men, their faces grim with purpose. Her heart sank. More questions, more accusations. Would it never end? But Holbrook didn't come to the door. Instead, the men surrounded the property, rifles visible. "Clara Whitmore," the deputy called. "Come out with your hands visible." Clara's mind raced. This was no casual questioning. She moved to the door, opening it slowly. "What's the meaning of this?" "Step outside, Mrs. Whitmore. Keep your hands where we can see them." She complied, moving onto the porch with deliberate calm. "I demand to know, you're under arrest." Holbrook cut her off. "For conspiracy in the murder of Thomas Whitmore and harboring a known fugitive." The words hit like physical blows. "That's absurd. Thomas died on the trail to California. You told me so yourself. New evidence has come to light." Holbrook's smile was cold. "Seems your friend Elias Cutter was spotted near where Thomas died. And those California gold coins he spent? They matched the mark of the mine where Thomas worked. Curious coincidence." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "No, that's not. Elias didn't even know Thomas." "So you say. But a woman who's buried 2 husbands, takes up with a known killer, and suddenly has her dead husband's gold circulating through town?" Holbrook shook his head. "Judge thinks that's worth investigating. Now come along quiet-like." "This is madness." But even as she protested, Clara saw how neatly the trap had been laid. The circumstantial evidence, the town's eagerness to believe the worst of her. "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one. In the county seat, before the trial." Holbrook gestured to his men. Search the place. Every board, every corner. They tore through her home with ruthless efficiency while Clara stood watching, hands clenched at her sides. They found nothing incriminating because there was nothing to find, but she knew that wouldn't matter. The story was too good, too neat. The widow's curse and her outlaw lover, conspiring to murder for gold, as Holbrook led her to his horse. Clara caught sight of Mrs. Henderson among the gathering crowd, her face bright with vindicated malice. Others watched from a safe distance, some with pity, most with the eager expressions of those witnessing a spectacle. My animals, Clara said. Who'll tend them? I'm sure the good people of Powder Ridge will see to it. Holbrook's tone suggested otherwise. They rode out with Clara's hands bound, leaving her life behind. As the cabin disappeared from view, she wondered if she'd ever see it again. The county jail was cold stone and iron bars, a far cry from her rough but clean cabin. Clara spent 3 days in a cell that smelled of despair and unwashed bodies before a lawyer arrived, a young man named David Garrett who looked barely old enough to shave, let alone defend someone's life. The evidence is circumstantial, he said, reviewing his notes. But the jury will be predisposed against you. A woman who's buried 2 husbands, associated with a known criminal. It doesn't look good. I didn't kill Thomas, Clara said flatly. And Elias had nothing to do with his death. Can you prove that? Can they prove otherwise? Garrett sighed. In a court of law, perhaps not. In the court of public opinion, you've already been convicted. He was right. The trial, when it came, was more performance than pursuit of justice. The prosecutor painted a lurid picture. Clara, tired of her husband's failures, conspiring with her lover to murder Thomas for his gold. Elias conveniently disappeared when suspicion arose, leaving Clara to face justice alone. The defense had little to counter with. Character witnesses were few. Who would speak for the widow's curse? The circumstantial evidence, thin as it was, seemed damning when presented to a jury already convinced of her guilt. Clara sat through it all with a kind of numb detachment, watching her life be rewritten into a penny dreadful novel. Only when they brought up Elias did emotion crack through, not at the lies about him, but at the kernel of truth within them. He had paid with gold coins. He had left suddenly. To outside eyes, it must seem obvious. On the 3rd day of testimony, as Clara was being led back to her cell, a commotion arose in the courthouse, shouting, the sound of a scuffle, then a voice that made her heart stop. Let me through. I need to speak to the judge. Elias, disheveled, travel-worn, but unmistakably alive and there. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway, and Clara saw her own shock reflected in his face. No, she whispered. He was supposed to be far away, safe from this madness. But Elias pushed through the crowd until the bailiff stopped him. I have evidence, he shouted. Evidence that Clara Whitmore is innocent. The judge, drawn by the disturbance, appeared in his chamber doorway. What's the meaning of this? My name is Elias Cutter, he said, voice carrying clear. And I can prove Clara Whitmore had nothing to do with her husband's death, because I know who did. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly before order was restored. Finally, Elias was allowed to approach the bench, flanked by armed guards. Your Honor, he began, I've spent the last weeks tracking down the truth about Thomas Whitmore's death. I have signed testimony from a man named Robert Walsh, currently imprisoned in Nevada for robbery. He confesses to killing Thomas Whitmore and 2 other miners for their gold. He produced a sheaf of papers, which the judge examined with growing interest. Walsh describes Thomas exactly, down to a scar on his left hand. Details only the killer would know. He's willing to testify in exchange for consideration on his current sentence. And the gold coins, the prosecutor demanded. The ones you spent in Powder Ridge? Elias met his gaze steadily. Honestly earned from a cattle drive to Montana last fall. I have the trail boss's statement here, confirming my employment and payment. More papers changed hands. The coins may be from the same region, but California gold all looks alike. The judge reviewed the documents while the courtroom held its breath. Finally, he looked up. This testimony appears credible. Why didn't you come forward sooner, Mr. Cutter? I had my own troubles with the law, Your Honor. Old warrants for horse theft. I couldn't help Clara while running from my own past. He straightened his shoulders. But I'm here now, ready to face whatever charges await me. Just see that she goes free. Clara's vision blurred. He'd come back, knowing it meant capture, possibly prison or worse. He'd come back for her. The court will recess to examine this new evidence, the judge announced. Mr. Cutter, you'll be held pending verification of these documents and resolution of your own legal matters. As the guards led Elias away, he managed to catch Clara's hand briefly. I couldn't let them take you, he said softly. Not for my sins or anyone else's. The next days passed in a blur. Walsh's confession was verified. Other evidence emerged. Thomas had been traveling with considerable gold, enough to tempt any road agent. The case against Clara crumbled like sand when the judge pronounced her innocent of all charges. Clara barely heard him. Her thoughts were with Elias, locked in a cell because he'd chosen her freedom over his own. But fate, it seemed, had one more turn. The horse theft charges Elias feared had grown cold. The statute of limitations expired while he ran. The ranchers he'd supposedly wronged had moved on or died. In the end, he paid a fine for disturbing the court and walked free. Clara was waiting outside the courthouse when they released him. They stood looking at each other, all the words they needed to say crowding between them. You came back, she said finally. I never really left. He touched her face gently. Even when I tried. The town won't welcome us, my reputation. Then we'll find a new town, build a new reputation. He pulled her close, and Clara realized she was crying. Marry me, Clara. Let me be the last name on your heart. She laughed through her tears, thinking of all the reasons to say no, the gossip that would follow them, the hard years that had taught her to guard her heart, the very real possibility that happiness was beyond their reach. Instead, she said yes. They were married the next day by a justice of the peace who didn't care about their history, only the license fee. Clara wore her best dress, the one she'd been mending the night Elias first knocked on her door. He wore a clean shirt and an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Third time, the justice joked as he filled out the certificate. They say it's the charm. Clara felt Elias tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand. Yes, she said firmly. The last time. As they walked out into the spring sunshine, legally bound and scandalously happy, Clara thought of the crosses behind her cabin, of Samuel and Thomas, loves lost to war and greed. They had shaped her, marked her, but they no longer defined her. Where do we go now? Elias asked. South. Clara decided, somewhere warm, somewhere new, somewhere they've never heard of the widow's curse. Oh, they'll hear of her, Clara said, smiling. They'll hear she broke her own curse, found love with a reformed horse thief, lived happily despite everyone's predictions. Elias kissed her there on the courthouse steps, in full view of the scandalized town. Let them talk, he murmured against her lips. We'll be too busy living to listen. And they were. The trial of Clara Whitmore became the most talked-about event in 3 counties. Every newspaper from Denver to Salt Lake City carried the story. The widow's curse, her mysterious lover, and the dramatic revelation that cleared her name. But while others gossiped and speculated, Clara and Elias focused on preparing their departure from Powder Ridge. They returned to Clara's cabin to find it ransacked but still standing. The chickens had scattered, though a few remained, pecking hopefully around the empty coop. The neighbors who'd promised to tend her animals had clearly thought better of associating with an accused murderess's property. We'll need supplies for the journey, Elias said, surveying the damage. And a wagon. Can't expect you to ride horseback all the way to Utah. Clara was gathering what remained of her belongings, precious few after the search. I have some money saved, hidden where even Holbrook's men couldn't find it. She pried up a floorboard near the hearth, revealing a small leather pouch. Thomas sent this before he died. I never touched it. Bad memories. But now, she hefted the bag, hearing the clink of coins. Now it can buy us a new start. Elias took the pouch, his expression thoughtful. This is what they thought we killed for. Ironic, isn't it? I had his gold all along, honestly sent, but they preferred their sordid story. Over the next days, they prepared methodically. Elias purchased a sturdy wagon and team from a rancher glad to see them go. Clara packed what household goods survived the search, sold the rest. The hardest part was visiting the graves one last time. She knelt between the two markers, wildflowers in hand. I'm leaving, she told the silent stones, but I'm not running anymore. I'm choosing. Elias waited by the wagon, giving her privacy with her ghosts. When she finally joined him, her eyes were dry. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer held her captive. Their departure drew a crowd. Some came to gawk, others to ensure they truly left Mrs. Henderson stood with her coterie, lips pursed in disapproval. But there were surprises too. Jake Morrison tipped his hat, looking ashamed. The minister's wife pressed a wrapped loaf of bread into Clara's hands. For the journey, she murmured, not meeting anyone's eyes. As they drove through town, Clara kept her gaze forward, but at the last moment, she turned back. I forgive you, she called to the watching crowd. All of you, may you find the peace you denied me. Then Powder Ridge was behind them, shrinking into memory. They traveled south through warming days, following trails carved by countless other seekers of new beginnings. At night, they camped under stars that seemed brighter away from town, away from judgment. Clara discovered joy in simple things, Elias singing old trail songs as he drove, the way he automatically helped her from the wagon, the comfortable silence of two people learning each other's rhythms. One evening, camped by a clear stream, Clara worked on mending while Elias tended the horses. Do you regret coming back? She asked suddenly. You were free, safe. You could have stayed that way. He settled beside her, taking the torn shirt from her hands. I was a lot of things, but never free. Not while you were facing that trial alone. But the risk. Clara! He cupped her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone. I've been running for 5 years. From the law, from grief, from any chance at feeling again. When I left you that morning, I thought I was protecting you, but 50 miles down the trail, I realized I was just running again, being a coward. You're no coward. I was, but you made me brave enough to turn around. He kissed her softly, to stop running and start living. They made love that night under the open sky, the sage-scented air carrying their whispered endearments. Afterward, wrapped in blankets and each other, Clara felt a peace she'd thought lost forever. They reached the town of Cedar Falls, Utah territory, in late April. It was smaller than Powder Ridge, but bustling with the energy of growth. The surrounding valley showed green with promise, mountains rising protectively on all sides. More importantly, no one knew them here. What do you think? Elias asked as they drove down the main street. Clara observed the busy shops, the mix of people going about their business. She saw curious glances, but no hostility. I think it could be home. They found lodging at a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Ruth Caldwell, who asked no questions beyond whether they could pay. Over the next weeks, they explored the area, eventually finding a small ranch for sale 5 miles outside town. The previous owner had died, and his distant heirs wanted quick cash more than Wyoming property. It needs work, Elias said, examining the rundown barn and overgrown fields. But the bones are solid. Good water, decent soil. We could make something of it. Clara walked through the small house, imagining curtains at the windows, flowers by the door. We? Unless you're planning to run off with another horse thief? He teased. No. She turned to him, serious now. One reformed thief is enough for any woman. They bought the property with Thomas's gold. Fitting, Clara thought, that his legacy would finally build rather than destroy. The work was hard but satisfying. Elias proved as capable with a plow as he'd been with repairs, while Clara established a garden and small flock of chickens. Neighbors, learning they were newcomers, stopped by with advice and occasional help. No one asked about their past. Clara began taking in sewing again. Her skills soon in demand. Elias found work breaking horses for local ranchers, his gentle methods earning respect. Slowly, carefully, they built a place in the community. One day in late summer, Clara was hanging laundry when she felt a wave of dizziness. She gripped the line, waiting for it to pass. But the sensation had been recurring for days now. That evening, she sought out the local midwife, Sarah Dawson, who examined her with knowing hands. "About 3 months along, I'd say." Sarah announced, "You're first?" Clara's hand went to her stomach, wonder and fear warring in her chest. "Yes, we haven't been married long." Sarah patted her shoulder. "Every child's a blessing, however it comes. You'll want to tell your husband soon. Men like to know these things." Clara walked home in a daze. A child. After years of barrenness with 2 husbands, she'd assumed herself incapable. Now, with Elias, she found him in the barn, brushing down a young mare he was training. He looked up, immediately alert to her mood. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She moved into his arms. "I'm pregnant." He went absolutely still. Then his hands framed her face, eyes searching hers. "Truly, truly." The joy that transformed his features took her breath away. He kissed her deeply, then dropped to his knees, pressing his face to her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your father, and I promise I'll do better by you than I've done by most things." Clara threaded her fingers through his hair. "You'll be wonderful." "A thief's child. A rancher's child," she corrected firmly. "Born to parents who chose each other against all odds." He rose, pulling her close. "What if the past follows us? What if someone recognizes? Then we'll face it together, like we always have." She smiled. "Besides, who would connect the respectable Cutters of Cedar Falls with a cursed widow and a horse thief? We're new people now, Elias. We made ourselves new." That night, as they lay planning for their unexpected blessing, Clara marveled at the turns life could take. A year ago, she'd been alone, marked by death and suspicion. Now she carried new life, slept beside a man who'd risked everything for her, and called a place home without ghosts. "Are you happy?" Elias asked in the darkness. Clara considered. Happiness had seemed like a foreign concept for so long, but feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, their child growing within her, their small ranch waiting for morning light. Yes, this was happiness, hard-won and precious because of it. "I'm happy," she said, and meant it. As autumn approached, bringing harvest and preparation for another winter, the Cutters of Cedar Falls were fixtures in the community. If anyone noticed that Clara sometimes touched the simple gold band on her finger like a talisman, or that Elias watched her with the wonder of a man who'd found treasure he never expected, they were too polite to comment. The past might always shadow them, but here in this valley, they were writing a new story, one with hope as its theme and love as its foundation, one worth living, worth protecting, worth passing on to the child who would never know the weight of being cursed. Let others tell tales of the widow's curse and her outlaw lover. Clara and Elias Cutter were too busy living their happy ending to listen. The baby came with the first snow of winter, arriving like everything in Clara's life, unexpected, challenging, but ultimately a blessing. Sarah Dawson, the midwife, declared it one of the easiest births she'd attended, though Clara, gripping Elias's hand hard enough to leave marks, would have disagreed. "A girl," Sarah announced, placing the squalling infant in Clara's arms, healthy and loud as a thunderstorm. Elias stared at his daughter with wonder bordering on reverence. "She's perfect," he whispered. touching the baby's tiny fist with one trembling finger. What should we call her? Clara studied the small face, already seeing hints of Elias in the determined chin, perhaps her own stubbornness in those piercing eyes. Hope, she decided. Hope Mary Cutter? After your mother? Elias asked, remembering she'd mentioned the name once. And yours? Clara smiled at his surprise. You spoke her name in your sleep once? Mary. It seems right, honoring both grandmothers she'll never meet. Hope grew like prairie grass, quick and resilient. By spring, she was crawling everywhere, investigating her world with fearless curiosity. Elias carved wooden toys that she immediately tried to eat. Clara sewed tiny dresses that lasted exactly as long as it took Hope to find a mud puddle. Their ranch prospered that year. The horses Elias trained sold well, and Clara's reputation as a seamstress spread to neighboring towns. They added to their small herd of cattle, planted more crops, even talked of building a larger house. We'll need more room soon enough, Clara said one evening, watching Hope pull herself up on a chair leg, determined to walk. Already? She's barely a year old. Clara placed his hand on her stomach, smiling at his shocked expression. 7 months from now, she'll have company. Elias kissed her deeply, then knelt to address Hope, who babbled at him happily. You hear that, little one? You're going to be a big sister. Think you can handle that? Hope responded by grabbing his nose and giggling. The second child, a boy they named Samuel Thomas, honoring the past while building the future, arrived the following autumn. Where Hope was tempestuous, little Sam was calm, content to observe the world from his mother's arms while his sister whirled around them both. 3 years passed in the rhythms of ranch life. The Cutters became pillars of the Cedar Falls community. Elias served on the town council. Clara organized quilting bees and helped establish a small school. If anyone wondered about their life before Utah, politeness kept them from asking. Then one day, when Hope was 4 and Sam nearly 3, the past found them. Clara was in the garden, Sam helping her pick beans while Hope chased butterflies. When a lone rider approached, something about his posture, the way he sat his horse, sent a chill down her spine. As he drew closer, she recognized him. Deputy Marcus Holbrook. Mrs. Cutter. Is it now? He dismounted, that same cold smile playing at his lips. Imagine my surprise, passing through and hearing about a horse trainer named Elias Cutter. Thought I'd see if it was the same man I once knew. Clara straightened, placing herself between Holbrook and her children. What do you want? Just paying a social call. See how the notorious widow's curse has fared. His eyes took in the well-kept ranch, the children. Seems you've done quite well for yourself. Does this community know what kind of woman is raising their children alongside theirs? They know exactly who I am. A rancher's wife, a mother, a neighbor. Not a woman who buried 2 husbands, who consorted with criminals. He leaned against his horse, clearly enjoying himself. Wonder what they'd think if they knew the truth. Mama? Hope tugged at Clara's skirt, eyeing the stranger warily. Who's that man? No one important. Sweetheart, take your brother inside. But before Hope could move, Elias appeared from the barn, rifle in hand. His face was stone, but Clara saw the anger burning in his eyes. Holbrook, you're trespassing. Cutter. The deputy straightened. Just catching up with old friends. No law against that. There is when those friends have asked you to leave. Elias stepped closer. We've built a good life here. Legal, honest. You've got no cause to disturb it. No cause? How about simple Christian duty? These people deserve to know. These people, a new voice interrupted, already know everything they need to. Sheriff William Tate of Cedar Falls rode up, flanked by 2 deputies, a good man who Clara had sewn shirts for, whose wife traded preserves for eggs. He positioned his horse between Holbrook and the family. Had a telegram from Powder Ridge. Tate continued conversationally. Seems their former deputy has been making a habit of harassment, following folks who've been cleared of all charges, trying to stir up old troubles. They suggested I might want to escort him out of my jurisdiction. Holbrook's face flushed. You don't understand. This woman is a respected member of our community, as is her husband. Whatever happened in the past, they've been good neighbors here. That's all that matters to us. Tate's voice hardened. Now, I believe Mr. Cutter asked you to leave. For a moment, Holbrook looked ready to argue. Then he saw the determination in the sheriff's face, the protective stance of his deputies. More than that, he saw Clara's neighbors, the Millers from the next ranch, old Mr. Peterson from town, gathering with the quiet solidarity of people protecting their own. This isn't over, he muttered, mounting his horse. Yes, Sheriff Tate said firmly. It is. Don't come back to Cedar Falls. Holbrook, you won't find welcome here. As the deputy rode away, Clara felt her knees weaken. Elias's arm came around her, solid and sure. Hope attached herself to his leg while Sam, picking up on the tension, began to cry. Thank you, Elias said to the sheriff. Tate tipped his hat. Tom Miller told me about your past when you first arrived. Wanted my opinion on whether to be concerned. He smiled. I told him I judge folks by what they do, not what they've done. Haven't seen reason to change that opinion. After the sheriff left, their neighbors lingered, Mrs. Miller helped Clara inside with the children while the men talked quietly with Elias. Instead of the judgment Clara had feared for so long, she found only support. We've all got pasts, Mrs. Miller said, bouncing Sam on her knee. What matters is the present, and presently, you're the woman who sat up all night with my Jane when she had fever. That's all I need to know. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara and Elias sat on their porch watching the stars. The encounter with Holbrook had shaken them both, but the response of their community had shaken them more, in the best way. They knew, Clara marveled. At least some of them knew, and they chose us anyway. We chose them too, Elias pointed out. Maybe that's what community really is, people choosing each other, past and all. Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid weight of their life together. 4 years ago, she'd been alone, marked by death and suspicion. Now she had a family, a home, a place where she belonged not despite her history, but encompassing it. Do you think he'll come back? She asked. No, and if he does, we'll face him, together, with our neighbors at our backs. He kissed her temple. We're not running anymore, remember? She smiled, thinking of Hope's fierce protectiveness of her little brother, of Sam's infectious laugh, of the new life already stirring in her womb, though she hadn't told Elias yet. 3 children. After years of barrenness and loss, she was building a dynasty of love. If there's a third time, she murmured, remembering the old saying about third times being charmed. Let it be forever. It already is, Elias assured her. Every day we wake up together, every child we raise, every season we weather, it's all forever. We're writing it one day at a time. Clara turned in his arms, studying the face she'd come to love so deeply. The scar was silver now, less prominent. New lines mapped their shared joys and sorrows. This was the face she wanted to see every morning for the rest of her life. I love you, she said, words that still felt like a miracle. My third husband, my last husband, my only love. And I love you, he replied. My savior, my redemption, my home. In the house behind them, a child cried out, Hope, probably dreaming. Clara rose to go to her, but paused at the door. Elias, we should probably start thinking about that bigger house. His eyebrows rose. Again? She smiled, hand resting on her stomach. Again? His laughter followed her into the house, rich and warm as summer honey. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, witnessing their happiness. Somewhere, perhaps, people still told the tale of the widow's curse. But here in Cedar Falls, Clara Cutter was simply a woman who had loved and lost and loved again, who had broken her own curse through courage and choice and the wild, impossible hope that third chances existed. And they did. Oh, how how beautifully they did. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the wild frontier of love and redemption. I hope Clara and Elias's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine to tell it. Where are you listening to this tale tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know, whether you're driving through the mountains, sitting by your own fireplace, or maybe even somewhere out in the wide western lands where stories like this were born. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of love, loss, and triumph in the American frontier. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Clara's journey? Have you ever believed in third chances? Share your reflections in the comments below. Until we meet again around the campfire. Partners, keep believing in the power of love to transform even the most broken of hearts.